Let's see.
Wow. If it works later on, I
can give you.
Labą dieną, mėly kolegos salėje ir žiūrovai prie televizijos ar kompiuterio ekranų. Tęsime šią mūsų konferenciją.
Okay, so we are continuing our conference, and it's a great pleasure to me to start the section 2 of the conference that is called Summer Events in 1941 in the Eastern Europe and the multi-perspectives of witnesses or testimonies. And now, during our first section 1 of the conference, the presentations were mostly based on archive sources and based on memories of people, testimonies of people who participated in events. In section 2, we step forward in a kind of double way. First of all, we'll be trying to look at the events of the conference, look at the events in Eastern Europe in summer 1941, based on the testimonies of participants. And because those people are our cornerstone, our source, on the basis of which we acquire some understanding about the events in 1941. In the Western countries, the different studies about the events of Holocaust and other traumatic events. There is an approach that focused both the researchers and the audience towards the witnesses of survivors of Holocaust. And the end of the 20th century is kind of referred to as the testimony epoch. And quite soon it was noticed that such stories of witnesses about the same events were different in terms of content and approaches, depending on the current place of residence of such witnesses, also depending on their life experience. Since then, also the language in which this testimony is rendered, and many other factors. So, one of such studies that inspired the subject matter for this section of the conference was Hanna Polingalei book about the ecology of testimony. Hanna Polingalei was one of the speakers in the conference, but unfortunately her plans have changed, and unfortunately she is not going to be present with us today. And this kind of approach, based on the witnesses of the survivors, victims. So this kind of is a focus for section 2. And I'm extremely pleased to invite the Professor Emeritus Ronald Berger from Wisconsin University, who is the author of numerous books published in the course of his career, and numerous articles about Holocaust,
naujausių turbūt knygų galima paminėti
And
studiją
one of his most recent publications is a
The
study,
Holocaust, Religion and Politics of Collective Memory.
Holocaust, Religion and Politics of Collective Memory, that was published in
Na ir naujausia jo knyga
2012,
paremta
and his most recent book,
mikroistorija,
based on
nuo šeimos
microhistory,
išsigelbėjimo istorija,
based on the
Children Save Yourselves, and
children's
Family Stories of Holocaust Survivors.
and the family story of Holocaust survivors.
Profesorius yra
So I hope that
suteikiu žodį
Mr. Ronald Berger is ready to join us, and we are inviting him to make his presentation.
Thank you very much. I'm honored to have been invited to participate in this panel, and especially pleased because I was asked to speak about my family's story of Holocaust survival. If we could have the PowerPoint put on now, and you could move to the next slide, please. Thank you. So this is the story about the survival of my father, Michael Berger, and my uncle, Saul Berger. They are the only two members of our extended Polish family who had not immigrated before the war to survive. My father survived inside the concentration camp system, including Auschwitz and several other camps, and my uncle survived outside of the concentration system by passing as a Polish Catholic among anti-Semitic Poles who would have threatened his life if they had known who he was. They were born in the town of Krosno, which is about 180 kilometers southeast of Krakow. When they were born, there were about 6,300 people living in the town, which almost tripled in size by the end of the 30s. And there were about 2,200 to 2,500 Jews. They were from a family of 5 sisters and 4 brothers. 3 of the sisters had immigrated to the United States before the war. My grandfather, Jacob, was a tailor by trade, and he told his sons that it was important for them to learn the trade of tailoring too. And if they learned that trade, he said he could promise them 2 things. They would never be rich, but they would never be poor. Little did he know that that trade that he taught them was one of the main reasons his son survived, because it gave them a tool that was useful for the Nazis to keep them alive. And that brings up a broader point that I wanted to mention, and that is that Jews did not face their ordeal as blank slates. They had prior experiences, individual attributes and talents, and collective resources that may have increased their chances. Moreover, Jews, like my family, did not passively accept their fate, but rather they engaged in strategic decision-making and calculated risk-taking that by no means assured, of course, their survival, but that did increase their odds. Now, if we could go to the next slide, please. I have a few photos from the family that we saved. This one, using my grandfather, Jacob, who was an Orthodox Jew who kept his head covered, my grandmother, Rosa, and I'm going to be using the English translations of what would have been their Polish names. At the time, my grandmother was pregnant with my father, and my uncle Saul is standing on the table next to Rosa. Next slide, please. These are the 4 youngest brothers. My father on the left is the youngest. It's my father, Michael, and my uncle Saul, my uncle Joshua, and my uncle Moses. Next slide, please. This is the tailor shop. There are other tailors who worked in the shop and actually slept in the attic, so it was a busy place. That's my father sitting behind the sewing machine, and my uncle is standing behind him in the back. Next slide, please. And this is what they looked at the onset of World War II. Next slide, please. Now, as I move to some of the text, we'll leave the slides on for a little longer. Before they embarked on their different trajectories of inside and outside the camps, they, of course, had common experiences. At the beginning of the war, when the Germans and the Soviets partitioned Poland, my father and uncle actually went over to the Soviet side, and they could see from very early on it would be better for them there. And they survived for a while as tailors. My father actually tried to be selected for a work crew that was going to ship people to Siberia, which he thought was preferable, but they didn't select him. He got it by the end of the year, a bad flu. They decided that they would go back home to recuperate and then try to persuade their parents to leave with them, because their parents were reluctant to leave everything behind. But by the time they got back, the relations between Stalin and Hitler were starting to deteriorate, and they never could get back. So, beginning in about January of 1940, they were living under German occupation. The Germans set up a Jewish council. My family was still able to live in their home, but they were no longer independent tailors, independent shopkeepers. They were now doing work for the Germans, making uniforms for German troops, doing a lot of personal favors for the Germans themselves. They were also conscripted for forced labor, shoveling snow in the airfields, cleaning the streets, loading and unloading coal at the train depot. During this time, my father and uncle had the nerve or the stupidity to engage in illegal black market transactions, buying salt and pepper one place, selling it for a profit the other, dealing in illegal currencies, trading Polish zlotys for dollars, which were more valuable to have. This is something they did on and off before the war, and they continued to do this. Even though they were required to wear armbands, they took them off. One time my uncle was arrested, and he was incarcerated for several months with some non-Jewish Polish political prisoners, including a Polish Catholic priest who conducted religious services multiple times a day. They took communion with bread and water, recited prayers, and my uncle paid close attention. He was a very observant man. He paid close attention, learned some of the prayers, and later on, when he was passing among Catholics, that was useful knowledge for him to have. Now, my slide jumps to May 42. So in between, we have the occasion of the conference, the invasion of the Soviet Union in July. Following the invasion, we have the famous Goering-Heydrich memo authorizing the planning of the final solution. In January 42, we have the Wannsee conference, which began the implementation of the final solution. All this doesn't really hit the small town of Krosno to about May of 1942, when they created the first ghetto in Krosno, which is only one block, long, with a few buildings that were overcrowded. But between May of 42 and August of 42, my family was still allowed to stay in their home under the conditions that they had before, and they had a little more food than the others. So that few months, they had it a little easier than a lot of the other Jews. And again, that was all because of the tailoring. The first mass murder of Krosno Jews occurred in August of 42, and everyone was required to report to the marketplace for resettling. Now, my grandfather was considerably older than my grandmother, because my grandfather's first wife had died during childbirth and actually married his first wife's younger sister, Rosa, which is my grandmother. So the first thing they did is round up all the older people and put them on the trucks that were to take them to their deaths. And as the truck was leaving, my grandfather pushed his way to the back of the truck and shouted out to his family who were standing there, "Children, save yourselves." I always thought that those were the most poignant words of the whole story, and even titled my last book after that. And this reflected a conversation that had been going on for quite some time between the parents and their children. They told them, if anything happens to us, we don't want you to become so traumatized that you would not be able to keep your wits about you and figure out what it is that you needed to do. That their greatest wish would be that they survive this ordeal. And so my father and uncle never experienced what some characterize as survivor guilt, feeling guilty that you lived and others didn't. They told me that that's not what their parents would have wanted, and by living, they fulfilled their greatest wish for them. So this was the situation. My father, uncle, and the other two brothers were then taken to the ghetto, leaving their mother and some of their other relatives behind in the marketplace. Later, they learned that those remaining Jews were taken to Belzec to be gassed, as opposed to my grandfather, who was just shot in the forest. Now they were living in the ghetto with the other Jews, but they were taken out during the day to go back to the tailor shop to work. Now a Pole in town was living in the home, which has basically been stolen from them, which we never got back, and was supervising their work. About a month later, in September, the Jewish Council was given an order by the Nazis that all the remaining tailors in town were going to be sent to a nearby work camp at Matarovka. I'm not sure exactly of the Polish translation. This didn't seem like a good idea to them. As it turned out, it wasn't the most horrible place, but this didn't seem like a good idea to them. So they went before the Jewish Council, the four brothers, and pleaded with them for an exemption. And my uncle, even though he was the second youngest, was essentially the leader of the family. By nature of his personality, he was the most assertive, and that's kind of the natural a thing that happened among them. And my uncle is arguing with the Jewish Council president, back and forth. We have so much work, we could be busy for a month. And it got pretty heated. So the Jewish Council president actually called my uncle a Schweinhund and said, enough. 2 of you go and 2 of you stay. So the brothers had to decide, what to do. So the plan was my uncle was going to stay with my uncle Joshua, because my uncle had a Jewish friend who worked for a Jewish printer that, like the tailor shop, had been taken over by the Nazis, and they were making official seals and for the Gestapo. And so the idea was to get fake IDs, somehow, smuggle them into the camp, which wasn't that far, to their other brothers, and they would all survive. That never really happened. My uncle did get passes for Joshua and him, but not his other brothers. And by September, they could see an extra buildup of troops. They weren't in denial of what was happening. And actually, a woman in town, her name was Maria Duchovsky, who was a Catholic friend of my grandmother, came into the shop when they were working and told them, you have to get out of here. They're going to kill you. But my husband, Tadeusz, is working with a Polish construction crew to the east. He's a foreman there. If you can get to him, he will help you. Maria did not tell Tadeusz that this was happening, but I guess she had confidence in her husband. So before the final mass murder of Jews in December of 42, My uncle and Joshua escaped. They planned to split up. My uncle Joshua was caught, sent to another ghetto, and he did not survive. Next slide, please. So I'm going to go through this in a very cursory manner because I don't have a lot of time. Normally, this would take me about 45 to 50 minutes to tell all the details. But you can see the different trajectories here. My uncle escaped. Tadeusz did give him cover from December to about February or March, working with this construction crew. My uncle would go to church. He knew a little bit what to do in Catholic Church from the experience when he was in prison. He never did go to confession, however, because he didn't know what to do. That wasn't something they did in the prison cell. And actually, the priest asked him, "How come you're not coming to confession?" He said, "Well, I went to the other town before, and I'll eventually come." Eventually, the bridge that they were working on, the construction crew was working on, was completed, and they were going to send the workers to the west on another project. And excuse me, Tadeusz told my uncle that he could go with him because they're going to do a strip search. And Jews at the time were the only ones that were circumcised, and that was the only thing that physically would have given them away. But my uncle and some of the other Poles, none of whom knew he was Jewish, were already planning to escape into the forest and join up with the Polish partisans. And this is what my uncle did. And these Polish partisans were anti-Nazi, but they didn't like the Jews. They'd sit around the campfire and say the one thing that Hitler was doing that was good was what he was doing to the Jews. My uncle actually feared they might kill him if they knew who he was. One of the things he had to do, a simple cultural trait for passing, is these men, these Polish partisans, drank this rather homemade, pretty raunchy vodka. And my uncle didn't drink, really, except for some wine at Jewish rituals. But he knew if he would say, "No, thank you, I don't drink," they would know that something's wrong with him. So he actually had to consume this stuff and sneak off to the side and throw it up, and then they wouldn't see him in order to pass as one of them. He had a number of quite interesting experiences during that time. Eventually, as the Soviet army was moving west, the partisans joined up with the Soviet army. At that time, my uncle would have been endangered of being sent to the front lines and being killed in combat. But he was able to bribe an officer with a watch he had accumulated that the officer enjoyed. My uncle had learned some German as a youth, and he offered his services as a translator for German prisoners of war. And actually, in order to do that, he had to become an officer in the Soviet army and become indoctrinated in Marxist-Leninism, which my uncle was on the right wing of the Zionist movement. My father actually was on the left wing of the Zionist movement. So my uncle was by no means a communist, but that's what he did. Meanwhile, in terms of my father, he was sent to that work camp at Motorovka. There they were doing tailoring services. They had food, they were working inside, it wasn't that bad. There was an incident that I don't have time to get into where my father actually was beaten severely to give them information. So it was by no means a picnic, but not as bad as the next camp, Shebnia, where my father and some of the other tailors at Motorovka were eventually sent in August of '43. They didn't have any gas chambers in Shebnia, but it was a hardcore concentration camp. The first time my father experienced backbreaking physical labor, starvation level diet. They would take prisoners out at random and shot them in the forest. One day, my uncle Moses, who had gone to Shebnia with my father, disappeared, and my father could only assume that he had been taken out and shot because he was never seen again. In many respects, Shebnia was just an assembly transit camp for Jews to be sent on further to Auschwitz. And my father, who was now pretty emaciated, in his underwear in a cold November, was packed in sardine-like conditions in cattle carts and taken to the infamous Auschwitz-Birkenau. The first thing that happened there for Jews was the selection, where they were ordered to line up. An SS doctor. My Mengele was there at the time. My father really doesn't know who was the doctor who was doing the selection when he arrived. And they were sorting Jews into two groups. One group looked more frail, emaciated, were sent in one direction. The other group, with Jews who looked a little healthier, were sent in another direction. And by now, my father was pretty acclimated to camp conditions, and he could kind of make sense out of what was happening with these two groups. And when he saw a man that my father described as having a, quote, obviously crippled leg, he knew he didn't want to go to that side. And when he was ordered to go to that side, he defied the order and went to the other side. And the whole thing was happening so fast and chaotic, and people screaming and dogs barking, that they didn't see him. And he realized he could have been shot on the spot, but he also realized that if he didn't try, he would be dead anyway. He was fortunate to only be there for about a month, and when he was taken over to Auschwitz-Birkenau, taken over to Auschwitz-Monowitz, which was the Auschwitz subsidiary, where Jews were made available by the SS to IG Farben industry. So they were to perform slave labor for a German corporation. Running out of time, I can't get into everything that happened to, him there. But when he arrived at Auschwitz-Monowitz, he could see that some prisoners were better off than others, and that if he were to survive, he needed to figure out how. And eventually, he embedded himself in a network of camp relationships that enabled him to get more food, and a lot of that had to do with his using his tailoring services to advantage influential people in the camps. Let me go to the next slide, and I can see my buzzer here. My time is up. So I can't get into everything that happened here, but my father went through the evacuation in Auschwitz, the death camp. He was eventually liberated by U.S. troops. My uncle, eventually, as the Soviets got control of Poland, left the Soviet army, returned to Krosno, participated in the Brücke movement, which were Zionists moving Jews, smuggling them out of Russian-occupied Poland. His intent was to go to Israel, but he got stuck in Italy and never made it. There he met his wife, or he had met his wife earlier, but they married there. The next and final slide, because I'm going to have to stop. My father eventually came to the U.S. in 1946, my uncle via Great Britain in 1950, and they settled in Los Angeles, California, where I was raised. So that is a cursory overview of my story, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this interesting and inclusive story, family story. I wonder, if I may to ask you, I wonder if this story was recorded by yourself, or it was recorded by somebody else, and which time this story or was recorded, or it was functioning, circulating all the time since the arrival to the USA?
Well, I appreciate that, and all that is a story in itself, so I'll give you the short answer. It is not something we talked about, and I did not learn of this in any detail until the late 80s. And part of it is that I'm kind of the sociological product of the Children of Survivor movement that became interested in their relative story. So it was at my request and interest that my father first told his story to me in any detail beginning in 1988. And it started out as kind of a family genealogy father-son project. But being a sociologist, I can see a sociological topic when it stares me in the face. And so I decided to turn this into professional interest and retrain myself in Holocaust studies, which I had not studied at all. My uncle was initially a little bit more reluctant to tell the story. He felt that since he hadn't been in a camp, he wasn't a genuine survivor, and it took him a while to get over that. But my father, it was just like that. We became obsessed about it. He died in the end of 94, but so that's how it happened. And then my uncle, I have to say that when my father was dying of lung cancer, during this time between 88 and his death, he became a public speaker at the Museum of Tolerance associated with the Simon Wiesenthal in Los Angeles and speaking to students of all ages. He became a survivor, a social construct that was not really available to him in an affirmative sense when he arrived. Well, when he was dying of lung cancer, he asked my Uncle Saul to promise him two things. And one would be to help my mother with her financial affairs, but also to take over his role as the spokesman to tell our family story. And from 1994 till, well, he died in 2016. A year or two before that, he wasn't able to effectively be a public speaker, but he really got into it, and his children eventually, my cousins eventually became interested in the story too. But it was really, I have to say, it was really me and my interest that got this going. But I see it more, as I mentioned, as in a sociological context. And there's stories too about how I came more specifically to be interested in, and hearing the story of one survivor in particular who came to my university was instrumental in me, and that was Robert. I'm blanking on his name, but he was the actor in Hogan's Heroes who played Louis Lebeau, who was a child survivor of France, and that was influential in me.
Are there any questions from our colleagues or any remarks to the speaker? Since I do not see anybody raising the hand, so allow me then to thank the professor for being with us today, and allow me to give the floor to professor from Heidelberg Ludwig, professor, cultural anthropologist and European ethnology staff member, Hanna Liebhardt. And allow me to introduce her very shortly. And the major direction of her research is a general one. This is migration, mobility, and transnationalism. And among the topics of her research would be the Eastern European Jews and the history of the diaspora and the culture in the 20th and the 21st centuries, as well as the Holocaust remembrance. And on top of that, the professor published a book a decade ago, which is related to Vilnius in particular, and it is called Vilna, a transnational memory story, the Jewish from Vilnius after the Holocaust. It was published back in 2010. And today, the topic of the presentation of the professor Anna Liebhardt is the following. 1941, in the memories of Vilna Jews, translocal perspectives from New York, Tel Aviv, Israel, and Vilnius. So, the floor goes to Anna Libhar.
Laba diena, and ačiū labai for the kind introduction.
Thank you for this kind of introduction. Dėkoju.
Can everybody hear me? Okay, I hope everybody can listen to me. In order to better understand what 1941 meant for the members of the Jewish community in Vilna, let me take you back to December 1942, 1.5 years after the German attack on the Soviet Union and the beginning of the German occupation. On December 20th, 1942, Yitzhak Kudaszewski, who has already been quoted today, a 14-year-old boy noted in his diary. Right? The ghetto schools today went to look at a part of the bas relief map of the city of Vilna, which is produced in the ghetto as a gift for the Gebietskommissar. The map will occupy 20 square meters. On a table under a reflector, there lies before us the center of the city of Vilna. On the plaster plates, every house, every little street is marked there, according to a given scale, 1 meter to 2,500. Everything is beautifully colored, worked out in an exceptionally beautiful manner. The children press forward to look at the map, and of course, each one looks for his house, his little street from which he came to the ghetto. Engineer Guchmann explains things to us. The Vilje, the Green Bridge, Schnippischok, and there's the cathedral. The children look hungrily at the beautiful hilly little streets around the Vilje and the Vilenke from which they have been expelled. The map of Vilna is certainly a great work of art of which we may be proud, because it could not have been created outside the ghetto. So much effort and patience was invested in the work as only a Jew can have at the present time. Since this is our work, we can be certain that we shall see the beautiful Vilna streets not only on the map, but in reality. End of quote. I have quoted this passage in length because it conveys the great affection, the powerful feeling of longing and belonging the cityscape of Vilna evoked in those Jewish children. Children whose world had been turned upside down in 1941 with the German occupation. In his reaction to the city model of Vilna, Yitzhak Kudaszewski directs our attention to the past, to the hometown of these children before 1941. He directs our attention to the present, in which these children have survived the violence of the German takeover, the traumatic expulsions from their homes to the ghetto, and the extreme violence and uncertainty to which they have been exposed for 1.5 years since. At the same time, Yitzhak Kudaszewski also points towards the future and the hope that, and I quote him again, that we shall see the beautiful Vilna streets not only on the map, but in reality. End of quote. The city model eventually outlasted the war, and I will return to it later on in the presentation. Yitzhak Kudaszewski, however, did not see the beautiful Vilna streets again. He was murdered in the fall of 1943 during the liquidation of the ghetto. The title of this conference is A Divisive Past, and the divisiveness refers to the national and ethnic fault lines on which much of the academic analysis as well as the public discourse about 1941 has focused since the end of the Second World War. In this presentation, I want to explore what we can gain in our understanding of 1941 if we employ a complementary perspective that orientates itself towards the experience of 1941, the local and translocal dimension of these experiences, and how this is remembered. The aspects I will address in the following are citizenship and local consciousness before 1941, the ghetto as a spatial experience, placemaking in the ghetto, 2 city models, translocal communal commemoration after the Holocaust, and remembering Vilna, the perspective of personal recollections. When we look back at the time before 1941, the primary identification of the Vilna Jews in the interwar period was with their city, not with any state. Living in a multi-ethnic border area, a strong local identity was a niche that helped them not to get into loyalty conflicts upon the frequent changes of political domination. The strong local Jewish identity was supported by further factors. The city's long, rather peaceful multi-ethnic history, and the fact that it was a multi-ethnic rather than a binational environment with a substantial Jewish community. And this community was not the only minority, but among the strongest population groups in the city. And last but not least, Vilnius is a beautiful city. It was a beautiful city. The topophilia and the local identity among all of its residents was very high, irrespective of their ethnic background. The cityscape was a frequent reference point in local Jewish folklore, literature, visual arts, academic research, and in the many popular science projects carried out by Jewish teachers, students, and other Jewish citizens in their private time. Both factors, the strong identification of Vilna Jews with their city and the widespread communal tradition of exploring the city, its geography and history, its urban development, and its architectural and artistic legacy, contributed to an exceptional local consciousness among this community. And I would also say what Rob has mentioned, the collective resources that Jews brought to the ghetto. I would say that this local attachment can be counted as an immaterial collective research, which they transferred into the ghetto. Now about the ghetto. No. Tensions between ethnic groups, along with a severe economic crisis, had been on the rise throughout the interwar period, and even more so after the occupation by the Soviet Union in 1939. It was, however, the German attack on the Soviet Union in June of 1941 and the subsequent German occupation of the city, which resulted in the most radical change for its Jewish community. 40,000 of the 60,000 Jews, that is 2/3, who had lived in Vilna at the very moment of the German invasion, were deported to Ponare and killed between July and December of 1941. At the beginning of September, the remaining Jews were resettled, and I put resettled in quotations marks, into 2 sealed-off ghettos the Germans had established on the territory of the Jewish quarter. 20,000 people now inhabited an area where before only 3,500 people had lived. And already in the interwar period, this had been when only 3,500 people had lived there, this had been the most densely populated district of the city of Vilna. The euphemistic expression resettled into the ghetto conceals several crucial aspects. The traumatic experience of being expelled from one's home and seeing everyone else from one's community being expelled too. The massive isolation, the little support from the non-Jewish neighbors, hunger, diseases, extreme helplessness and vulnerability, being exposed to and witnessing extreme violence, death, dealing with existential uncertainty, and having no place to escape to, became the new reality for Jews of Vilna, as well as in all other Jewish communities on Lithuanian territory after June 1941. Placemaking in the ghetto. Coming back to the 3-dimensional city map from my introduction. This project was originally initiated by the infamous Franz Murer, who at the time served as the deputy of Gebietskommissar Hans Christian Hingst, and by Jakob Gens, the head of the Judenrat. Jewish engineers, architects, and artists, as well as historians, put all their effort in rebuilding their hometown as accurately and detailed as possible. Their project provided them with a work permit and kept them from being killed in Puna. Furthermore, they were able to leave the ghetto for measuring streets and buildings, which in turn allowed them to acquire food and to get in contact with the non-Jewish resistance. Besides these vital side effects, the city model encompassed an important emotional spiritual dimension. The project team stayed after the official work hours to carefully form and paint the small buildings. The ghetto population was thrilled by it. Parts of it were displayed in one of the ghetto's art exhibitions, and many people came to the workshop to take a look at it, and among them were the school children with Yitzhak Rudashevsky. At the same time, a second three-dimensional scale model was built in the ghetto, in the same workshop. Oh, 1 second. The second model, however, was produced illegally by members of the original team who were also part of the Jewish partisan group FPO. It was most probably intended to prepare for armed resistance and hidden from the Jewish public in the ghetto. It bears the official stamp of the ghetto and the date in 1943 when it was completed. As you can see from this historical photograph, it showed only the ghetto in 3 dimensions, including the canalization, nothing beyond. The rest of the city was 1-dimensional, sketched out in paint. This ghetto model also outlasted the war and was among the Jewish artifacts survivors recovered after the liberation. When Vilnius was liberated in July 1944 by the Red Army, only a few hundred Jews in the city were found alive. When the war finally came to an end in May 1945, 3,500 to 4,000 Vilna Jews in total had survived, most of them in the eastern parts of the Soviet Union, to where they had been deported along with Lithuanians and Poles by the Soviets in June 1941, a week before the German invasion. Or they had managed to flee in the intervening days or during the invasion. The rest had mostly survived in the forced labor camps in Estonia and Latvia and in hiding or the forests. Apart from a few exceptions, the survivors who returned to Vilnius left the city for good between 1944 and 1947 under the repatriation treaty negotiated between Poland and the Lithuanian Soviet Socialist Republic, and went through Lodz to the DP camps on German territory. Around 1,200 to 1,500 each eventually resettled in the United States or Israel. The others in Canada, Latin America, Australia, South Africa, and Paris. In their new places of residence, they established Vilna Landsmannschaften, or hometown associations, as they are called in English. The most active among them were Nusach Vilna, the Vilna Hometown Association in New York, and the Ergut Yotze Vilna Vehasviva in Tel Aviv and Haifa. In Vilnius, the historical cityscape remained, but the population was almost completely exchanged. Vilna Jews left, together with the majority of the Polish population. Ethnic Lithuanians, mostly from the countryside, and Russians moved in, who had no idea about the city's Polish Jewish past. The new Jewish community in Vilnius was made up by people who moved to the city from other parts of Lithuania or other Soviet republics. In the 1960s, when the Vilna survivors had settled in their new countries of residence, the hometown associations started to turn the focus of their activities from mutual support of their members to large-scale memorial projects. In 1966, the ghetto fighter kibbutz in Israel, where some Vilna survivors had settled, prepared to add a Vilna room to its Holocaust exhibition. Around the world, Vilna memorial communities were set up, which at the beginning mainly tried to raise money. Soon, however, an intense transatlantic debate between the Vilna activists in New York and in Israel began on the design and content of the exhibition. They decided that the central object should be a replica of the three-dimensional city model, which had been produced in 1942. Some of the people who had worked on the original project in the ghetto had settled in Israel and wanted to reconstruct it for the ghetto fighter kibbutz. But there were no photographs of it or other visual materials, and the original was, if still existing, unattainable due to the difficult political relations between the Soviet Union and the State of Israel at the time. The plan was abandoned. In Israel, it was later decided to build a replica of the ghetto model, which I just showed you before. And I will now show you how it looks within the exhibition in Luhameha Ghetto. This decision caused a long, heated debate with the New Yorker co-organizers about the issue of appropriate geographical representation of their former hometown. The New Yorkers protested, and I quote, "A city culturally so rich as Vilna, with a long Jewish history, cannot be reduced to the ghetto," end of quote. Despite the conflict, the exhibition in Israel was eventually opened on September 3rd in 1972, the 29th anniversary of the liquidation of the Vilna ghetto according to the Jewish calendar. It became a great success with Vilna survivors around the world, as well as the many Israeli school classes and army recruits who visited the ghetto fighter kibbutz in the following decades. During the ethnographic fieldwork for my dissertation, I made several attempts to track down the city model Yitzhak Rudashevsky so vividly described in Vilnius. In summer 2004, after working my way through the complex administrational structure of the Jewish Museum in Vilnius, Rosa Bielauskiene, the head of the preservation department, finally told me that the Jewish Museum had received the model from the Museum of Architecture in 1990, shortly after its foundation, when tracing Jewish objects in Lithuanian collections. She took me to the storage area and pointed out a couple of wooden boxes that were stapled in a corner. After removing some 300 dusty Russian and Yiddish books placed on top of the boxes, she opened the first one. 1 second. No. No. Yeah. This plate shows the main boulevard, former Mickiewicza, today called Gediminas Prospektas, connecting the cathedral with the affluent neighborhood of Schwerin. And when you look to the left, you see the bridge across the river, the Nerijus. This is where the Seimas is built today. And when you go to the right, this is where the cathedral would be on the next plate. The other plates look similar. The townscape is meticulously designed and recognizable, so most of the tiny buildings have fallen off from the plaster foundation and are crumbled up in a corner of the box. The centerpiece, however, had not been among the plates received from the Museum of Architecture and is presumably lost. It showed the university area, the Jewish quarter with the Schulhof, and the cathedral. The former heart of the Jewish city has disappeared and left a void in the model. Today, it is the ghetto model that is on display, a concept closely reflected in the ambitious urban restoration program in the old town of Vilnius, which aims to achieve a reconstruction of ghetto fragments. It is thus the introspective ghetto model and not the city model. It is the violently reduced, isolated version of Jewish Vilna and not the full-fledged, integrated version of it, symbolizing citizenship, providing hope and good memories, that has taken over and dominated the three-dimensional spatial representation of this community in the aftermath of the Holocaust. The ghetto model standing for the distinctiveness of the Jews as for their exclusion and persecution was exhibited. The city model that had been so important to the ghetto inmates, precisely because it did not show them the ghetto, but the rest of their city from where they had been expelled, was stored away and forgotten. I want to conclude with some short impressions from the personal recollections of Vilna survivors. The city landscape of Vilna remained the central reference point in the artistic, poetic, and historical studies that have been created by the survivors. Here you see a picture by Shmuel Bach, who as a child won a painted competition in the ghetto. There are many other pictures that show the destroyed Jewish cityscape, the ruins of the old Jewish quarter or the ghetto. Visiting the homes of survivors in New York and Israel, they, however, provided me with very different views of the city when I asked them about their favorite pictures. This was the photograph shown to me by Nusra and Leo, who survived the ghetto as teenagers and today live in Manhattan. Taken during a recent visit to Vilnius, it shows the Nerijus on the outskirts of the city where they used to spend their summers before 1941. And one last picture. This is Sally, the granddaughter of a survivor, proudly posing in front of the popular tourist poster which her grandmother brought her as a souvenir from a visit to Vilnius. Even more important, however, is the little doll you can see next to Sally on the sofa. The doll is another gift her grandmother brought her from Vilnius. And the name of the doll is Vilna, because, as Sally explained to me, she is a girl. Thank you.
Ačiū labai, profesorė, už irgi įdomų pasakojimą ir vizualinį taip pat pateikimą.
Thank you very much, Professor, for a very visual presentation. It indeed shows the construction of memories and the functioning of memories post-event, reconstruction of memories. Are there any comments or questions from the audience? I don't see any raised hands. I'm very happy to be able to invite my friend, my dear friend and colleague from the Faculty of History, Associate Professor Nerijus Šepetys, who is the best expert on the totalitarianism and the researcher, the best known famous researcher in this area, and whose contribution into this field is mainly known to the German-speaking academic world, because he is the author of the book Lithuanian in the Dritten Reich, Lithuania in the Third Reich, as well as he's the author of a conceptual selection of articles compiled a couple of years ago, and that was compiled on the occasion of presentation of Lithuania during the Leipzig fair. Fortsetzung Volk in Zugerne Moderne. This is the name of the compilation of the articles that I am referring to. Now I would like to invite Nerijus Šepetys to share his insights about the outbreak of the war and about the different perspectives and different narratives. And the topic of his presentation is the testimonies on the outbreak of war in Lithuania, the challenge of understanding.
Ačiū Arūnui už nepelnytai iškilų pristatymą.
Thank you very much, Arūnas, my dear friend, for such a prominent presentation. Dear audience, who has gathered in the town hall as well as who are watching us online. So allow me to thank Professors Berhard and Liebhardt for the highly enriching and inspiring presentations, which yet again make us understand the status of an independent perspective or independent dimension and the importance of the linguistic the importance of the place of experience, the historical and linguistic environment, as well as the landscape of the memory. I would like to thank also, in addition to Professor Pauline Galli, who first agreed but later declined the invitation on the ecology, which is meant for the testimonials given by the survivors of the Holocaust, how to interpret it, and additional to the unknown theoretical innovation. And this could become a bridge between the history and the memory of the past few decades. I have to admit that I have come up with this idea of the last panel of our conference. That is me, who is the author of this panel, because the research made by these authors, I believe, can enrich deeply the histories and the narratives and the memories of the war and the narratives of the survivors of the Shoah, the Holocaust, and to be enriching for all the members of the society. And what can I offer in exchange? Well, I do not conduct such an in-depth research as my colleagues. I'm going to confine myself to a few rather abundantly illustrated but unstructural methodological remarks about the problems of understanding and perception which we have to solve when we turn back to testimonies. Of course, we can leave them unanswered, but my colleague Saulius Sužiedėlis just illustrated the importance. I will try to keep my attention and my focus on both of the testimonies and the experiences of reality. So I will try to stay in the field of understanding history and memories, even if it can only lead us to raising even further questions and statements of problematic issues. We have heard from the previous presentations what meaningful could be done having even a couple of testimonies. If you decide to go along the path of memories or biographies or the diaries, we have to understand that there is also an alternative available also in the field of history. It could be a negative alternative. So what kind of alternatives or options we have? The traditional option that was mainly typical of the last decade is to ignore the testimonies altogether. And the second negative option would be to instrumentalize them or to make them as a tool of illustrations of your presentations, of mere illustrations of established or perceived knowledge, on which we are trying to reconstruct the past. And it has even a special term for that in the research literature, which is a source mining. We may know something in advance, then we find justification of our theory, and then we present it as a fact, without going into any further details. So before we start using any source, we need to make a very systemic evaluation of the sources. And especially in this field of study of the Holocaust and in the outbreak of the war and in the research of the memory, it has been and it is still a widespread reliance on certain testimonies of a certain type of surviving witnesses. And it is not only on memories or testimonies left by the surviving witnesses, but also documents from the official Nazis or Soviet regime documents. in which the essential narrative is often overlooked, such as Meldungen or the protocols of interrogations of witnesses have also to be taken with very cautions. The value of testimonials, which are not examined by themselves, but are rather used to explain history, the value of such testimonials is determined quite formally. Personal notes are assessed by historians from their proximity in time, so there could be diaries written immediately after events or some recollections or memoirs after a couple of decades. So we always have to look into the professional publication. And there are video interviews collected in the Fortunov's archive or some anthropological stories of survivors that were collected from the surviving victims at home of the surviving victims in the family environment by way of avoiding interrogating questions and by raising open-ended questions. On the other hand, there are the so-called voluntary fictional memoirs which could be which should be taken with some sort of deeper reflection. So whenever we are talking about the events or the sources from a historical point of view, we shall look at each individual case on a case-by-case basis, because the distance or proximity with the time and alienation from experiences indeed makes a certain account of events somewhat different. So there may be, as well as imagination is just as important. It is as valuable immediately after event or after a certain while. Accuracy is not determined by the memory, but rather by the will. But of course, it is very important when a particular testimony was written, especially by when it was amended or redacted. More important is the intention of the author and the concern of the writer. By naming this concern in the memoirs or in the diary may not necessarily coincide with this concern, as it is in the mind of the witness, whether the person is seeking to incriminate the perpetrators or to serve a possible justice in the future, to protect against any other future persecutions, either real or only alleged persecution. So there is indeed a very full list of possible motives. And according to the conventional formula is when we are trying to recount on what has been done by not trying to fit into the grand narrative and without fighting for the right cause, and it is quite a rare thing. This is a rare thing. We can catch it in the memories, just as it was Samuel Bach's late autobiography, which we can find in Streikus, or in a Spartan type of environment, in a video recording, as well as in the personal conversation, in a home environment after 50 years, or in a simultaneous, secretly scribbled diary and hidden somewhere in the walls. It is necessary to search for such resources, but we need to research and use them and check whatever comes our way. We have to understand that the readily available testimonies may not necessarily be suitable, as there may be some misunderstandings or confusions between the facts. From the historical point of view, delving into the surviving testimonies of contemporaries, it is worthwhile constantly looking into the relationship between the experience and the narrative, between the content of the narrated time experience and the assessment and the assessment of the time of the narrative time. We need to understand our own perception and our own understanding and our own approach to the testimony at hand. To understand things always means to understand the previous understandings altogether, even when we have some difficulties with that. And the second methodological block of remarks is related to the Second World War. And, well, it is not accidental that I named the thing, the testimonies of which I'm analyzing, as war. The place that we're talking about today is called Lithuania, but then, from the point of view of both parties waging at war, it was the German Reich and its occupied territories, or the Soviet Union and the territories annexed and occupied by the Soviet Union. And both parties, either orally or in writing or by their active actions in 1939 or 1940, ensured that there would be no emerging or no reinstituted states. So no Latvia, no Estonia, no Lithuania, and annexation or annihilation of these states was the result of their secret cooperation. And the first such result was the beginning of the outbreak of the war, which we call the Second World War today. And the war that we're talking today is an integral part of that other war, and the latest stage in which cooperation is transformed from cooperation or collaboration into a fatal, destructive confrontation between the former allies in the lands of sphere of influence that they divided among themselves. Even if we decide to ignore these territorial transformations as a non-aggression treaty in the secret protocol, the Lithuania of September 1939 and the present-day Lithuania are two different Lithuanias. The Republic of Lithuania since 1923 was ruled by autonomous region of Klaipėda, but then it was waived in favor of German, with some sense of mutual relief. And the Ponal, having finally established itself in Vilnius in the country in the autumn of 1945, and according to the secret protocol, this region was handed over to Lithuania. So, from a historical point of view, during the whole war, Klaipėda underwent only one fundamental transformation, which was the Soviet occupation in January at the junction of 1944, whereas Vilnius, meanwhile, experienced at least 5 transformations: the temporary Soviet occupation, the military political occupation of Lithuania, the Soviet occupation in 1940, and annexation, the war and the German occupation, which evolved into the civilian rule, and by some was perceived as German-Lithuanian occupation, and again followed by the Soviet occupation. So I have counted from 5 up to 7 transformations, whereas the remainder part of Lithuania, the Kaunas Lithuania, underwent only 3 fundamental changes during the war: the Soviet Nazi and the Soviet occupations, although their courses were different. So, following mainly Yehuda Bauer, Timothy Snyder focuses on the impact of such transformations, for instance, to the readiness of people to use violence. When there was a destructive and foreign Soviet rule, and this readiness to violence was much more prevalent with the onslaught of the Soviet rule. In other words, the German-USSR war, seen from the bottom, was a continuation of the war and the transformations that they caused in the region as a new stage and not as a new story. And so that was an historiographical excursion. In historiography, usually there is a narrowing down of the prospects. A couple of years ago, there was a doctoral thesis, German thesis, was the memories of war, the Lithuania and the Second World War. And the author of this doctoral thesis, Yekaterina Makhotina, starts with the following insight. Lithuania occupies a special place in the landscape of the Lithuanian memory. For everyone who has been socialized in Western European and primarily German memory culture, the absence of the memory of the Second World War will definitely stand out here. And the emphasis is on the memory of the Gulag, end of quote. It is quite a bold statement which needs to be corrected. First of all, Makhotina, as it turns out, she is referring not to the Second World War, but to the German-USSR war, which, again, in her whole thesis, she calls the Great Patriotic War, the way it is known in Russia. Secondly, the dimension from which she is speaking is not not the dimension from the Western Europe, but rather the culture of the veterans of war. The veterans of the war, which was defined as an independent concept in the speech by Stalin of July the 3rd, 1941. And in this statement, Stalin explained what the war, the Great Patriotic War, is meant, or how it should be understood. So quite ironically, according to the Russian Federation law, which is called the Veterans Law, again, to be regarded as veterans of Great Patriotic War shall be regarded also commanders and control personnel of internal affairs, and then liquidation battalions, fighters and commanders of squads which were involved in military operations, liquidating the nationalistic underground in the territories of Ukraine, Belarus, Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia from January 1944 until December 1951. End of quote. So Mechotina doesn't miss the memory of what is called the elimination of the underground under the Russian Federation law, and instead, in the countries themselves, it is known as the anti-Soviet resistance. So from the status of the participants, it is the same Great Patriotic War. So from this confusion of illustrated historiographical misunderstanding, we can deduce a very formal lesson. Indeed, when the subsequent and the much stronger experience of 1941, it can overlap the previous experience of 1939, so that it is completely overshadowed without any Stalin. The same Yehuda Bauer observes a similar point in 1939 in the period of Soviet occupation in those lands. So he says, when we read the testimonies of the survivors of the massacre, we see that the Nazi occupation has ensured that what was before would be pushed away from the memory and erased from the memory. So I believe that this holds true not only about the occupational diachrony, the experience of the massacre itself overshadows the whole pre-massacre experience. And if you're lucky enough to survive, then your diaries are then clearly overwritten, edited, added or deleted. And memories of things that appeared later are somewhat depicted as having happened before, or conversely invisible at all, depending more on the search for incriminating justice. And now we can move on to the specific examples now. The invasion of Poland and divisive experience. So there is a very clear tendency to gloss over some important events. Lithuanian historical writers are reluctant to notice the Polishness of Vilnius, as if Vilnius was destined to become part of Lithuania, and therefore the layers of experience and memory that were then episodic were marginalized. On the other hand, the Poles and the Jews who survived the war could take the 1939 Soviet rule as a starting point. So Vilnius in this case could be perceived as having almost jumped from the Polish hands into the Soviet hands, and simply returning to Lithuania. And the first example that I found from the manuscript, which was not edited, and it was published post-mortem by Josef Mackiewicz without any fear of public reactions. It was published as lived as a survived experience, by way of referring to the accuracy of the impression. And the accounts of events of September 18th and 19th are conveyed as the pernicious embrace of the two aggressors, from which there is only one way out, just as the author did. The only way out is to flee, and to flee to Lithuania. In his later entries, he mentioned that was a road leading nowhere. And again, already as a reflection, everybody has left, is also referred by another author in Kaunas, and the last Polish Republic ambassador to Vilnius, Leonas Mitkiewicz-Žoltek, who rang in Vilnius that nobody is there, everybody ran to Lithuania. And indeed, this situation, when in the face of the Russian aggression in Lithuania, there were many Polish refugees, was indeed quite a phenomenon. At that time, it was written as a diary, and it was not an edited diary. So therefore, there was a double loss of the demise of the homeland and the Bolshevik invasion. Showed what was the tremendous memories or experiences that the Polish people have lived through. There was a completely different account of the events of the Jews on the other side of the river. And we remember how people were running from one place to another, or they were driven from one place to another. And there were many research done of possible ways of how to get rid of the Jews by way of shifting them from one place to another. In 1939, in Vilnius, there was the Jewish Refugee Committee, which took care of reducing to paper those memoirs of the runaway Poles and Jews. And there were quite a few Polish, more Poles than the Jews, who ran away from the occupied Poles. And they have an excerpt here on the screen. The shoemaker of Sierpts, who along any other testimonials from the borderline area, it was published roughly 1 month after the event. Without home, without family, without property, and Lithuania becomes a temporary shelter for runaway Poles and the Jews, and they were planning to live together with the absolute majority of Vilnius population after the war in peace in the new Poland. They already have a furious, deadly, gloomy and menacing experience of war that most Lithuanians do not want to see. And this is a fundamental experience which the later experience is not going to overshadow. That was an expulsion from the borderline area by deceit. Now moving on to the main area, June 1941, and the outbreak of war, German-USSR war. So the main fault of the historiographical resources, as well as the commemorative and political perceptions, which can be seen also from the title of the conference, is the collapse of events and the different processes which are seen through a single act model and understood from a strictly retrospectively. And the great narrative of the outbreak of the war usually identifies the actual course of events with what it should have been, that it was an inevitable and it couldn't be avoided. A very fast and victorious march by the Wehrmacht, the hasty and chaotic retreat of the Red Army, and the withdrawal of the Soviet troops, anti-Soviet actions and even process, anti-Jewish Einsatz groups, campaigns and operations, as if everything was according to the German plan. The one-sided attitude is usually characteristic even of those subconsciously or consciously is also felt in the papers of the researchers who, whenever they are analyzing the Shoah, they are not anti-nationalists. They are raising questions about the internal catastrophes of the Red Army. They do understand that Soviet campaigns were not usually directed from Berlin, and in the case of Lithuania, from the Love Center. And I'm going to refrain from criticizing the historiography, and I'm going to review the excerpts from the testimonies, which pay special attention to the very outbreak of the hostilities. So not only in the context of what military actions were followed during the Soviet or anti-Soviet activist or special forces, but I'm going to focus on the transformation from peace to war. And I'm going to give you 4 examples from Vilnius, 3 from Kaunas, 3 in the province, each of them in a different genre. I'm going to start from Vilnius testimony, in which there were bombs and shelters, movements and emptiness, or the void left by the people who left. And some of the speakers have already quoted a number of such testimonials. So we have quite a few testimonies from Vilnius of people who survived and escaped Vilnius, who hid their memoirs but perished at war.
Čia cituojami žydų dienoraštininkai.
So we have some quotations from diaries and from Jews and one Lithuanian poet. I selected those quotations just to illustrate the diversity of approaches and memories. And of course, time is the major factor. But one diary of a young Jew starts as a Soviet young man, that's one of the clearest memories of a resident of Vilnius. He speaks like a schoolboy. This comes from the first day, and he speaks about the first day, but later on the situation changes and his views change too. He speaks like a pioneer, and in his imagination he is seeing visions, and he is seeing like a movie. He sees Germans and he sees the Russian army, and so something that we used to see in our childhood, from the movies that he had never himself. So he is so he speaks about killing the enemy at my own land and shooting them to their backs. So this sounds some kind of ideological cliches, strange from where, and he speaks about the black shining helmets and red stars. And from this quite cliche ideological notes, we see some impressions, personal impressions, where he sees the coming of the Germans and withdrawal of the Russians. It's like a way to abyss, and he all of a sudden sees a Lithuanian person with a gun and a closed school. And in this relation, I remember the citation from my colleague, who speaks about the void. He speaks about the void that where there is no governance, so there are some other structures appear. And at the same time, from the teller, we see the process that how this willful conscious is broken into something devastated, who understands that reality is formed by invincible forces. Miliūnas, the poet, he is no longer young. He does not tend to add things, to imagine things. He tends rather to omit things. Not only he knows what, not only because he knows what is going to happen, but maybe because he is not really much concerned about that. He feels that void too. one forces has withdrawn and the other still has not come. So the Lithuanian patriotic fighters of today perhaps would look at the place where somebody would occupy Gediminas castle. Maybe Nazis would look at that, looking for Nazis. But this poet, what he sees only a group of motorcycles, so that is some kind of void which shows that transformation is taking place deep inside. The third example, for which I am grateful to Vilnius Gaunas Jewish Museum, that is taken from the diary of Kalmanovich, who is going to be published in Lithuanian. So that is an impression of a person whose social aura is quite different. He is contacting with the Jewish community, also with the Soviet officers and their wives, and he put this down a year later, but nevertheless he tried to maintain the authentic impressions that he experienced, but also showing some perspective approaches, but not, without making it the overwhelming narrative. We speak about the fear of bombing, confusion, but also thoughts at the same time that occurred to him based on his previous experience and also based on his beliefs, on his understanding of time. And he speaks about that the alliances became enemies, so maybe one day will live in a world where the mankind will be freed from any of those and will become again that sweet, nice place that I used to know in my youth. So that is a very deep side diary of a very insightful person. He speaks about the ghetto differently from his friend Herman Kruk, who was a very active participant of the cultural resistance in ghetto. He was about 10 years younger and very experienced fighter from Poland, so he did not withdraw. He had a chance to leave for America, but he didn't want to commit to the Soviets. He decided to stay and become a historian, but that is not a capitulation, that is some kind of attempt to take the position of the observer, at the same time saying that nevertheless, anyway, Germans will be bringing all the Jews to the ghetto. So he sees everything at the same time recording what leaves the void, and that void results from the fact that there is no government at all. So he says that any government could bring any hope around. So from Vilnius we moved to Kaunas. There's some diary that was written in Kaunas, but some diaries that that survived actually lost their beginning and unfortunately did not reach us. In other words, with time, some diaries were rewritten, and that's why I just selected some diaries that presents kind of a mixture of reflections on different time, and maybe that reflects the general mentality or worldview of residents of Kaunas. So, a German painter, citizen of Lithuania, and the wife of a bookbinder of Jewish origin, Helen, writes that with great pain, having lost part of her family, she tries to record those images in a plastic manner, like a painting. This is some kind of personalized image. So she shows in the same picture the withdrawing Germans and the incoming Russians or the Soviet army. So they see the black wave and Lithuanian partisans who were following the orders to catch the Jews, and at the same time initiating some revolution. Those processes, some seem isolated, but they are connected in the consciousness of the observer as a fluent historical narrative. Just like Holzman, the diary of Dory, Dory is being quoted extremely frequently and extremely free of any criticism. But the problem is that certain things were recorded much later, and although the impressions from June the 22nd were put, he was in his apartment in Laisvės alėja in Kaunas, but later on they were adjusted and aligned with the new knowledge, and in the original copy that was not sufficiently pointed out, and that's why a diary is being quoted as original, which is really not quite fair. So he was speaking about the general mood in Soviet institutions, but how can he possibly know that? And also he was speaking about on June the 22nd in Kaunas crowds, there were some people provoking riots and speaking about death to Jews and so on. Quite possibly that could have been, but that does not really seem like a serious historical source. It's just a personal impression. And this is some kind of problem with people writing from Kaunas, because in their diaries we can see Lithuanians and Jews and Germans speaking about the same thing. There was one person writing about that his main problem that was caused with the launching of the war was that he couldn't get to the concert. In general, he was happy with the war, but that was quite a nuisance. From this diary, we can see some kind of typical Lithuanian habit. It's to listen to the radio and their discourses. And quite typically, such diaries are adjusted not by the author, but by the publishers. And it's not possible to know what has been omitted. So the general approach is that Jews tend to add new things and Lithuanians tend to omit something. So some things are created newly and maybe added in the wrong place time-wise, and some are omitted. Then, speaking about the provincial areas of Lithuania, there is a database of the letters from people from provincial areas. Currently, this database is not accessible. I would like to point out that some such recollections still characterized by similar problems. So the beginning of the war, the beginning of war was not much mentioned in that diaries, but more mentioned the events that took place immediately after. So some speaking about for Lithuania, for Russians, for Germans, and that shows the diversity of views. There is a diary of Vladislavas Skveretskas, where he speaks about the wisdom of Hitler and mentioning the Jews. But what he wrote on the first day, it is clear that a quite characteristic of such middle-aged intelligentsia living in provincial areas was a cognitive dissonance, some kind of some kind of regurgitation.
Nuotaikos provincijų užsifiksuoja, šitas šaltinis puikus pavyzdys, kad artumas laike
some kind of generation of the impressions. We can see the same in diaries. It's simply sometimes just impossible to understand what the diary is about, what he likes or what he sees or what is going around. So it's difficult to see the link between the person and his thoughts. So those diaries are really very few and their quality is quite poor. So if you look at the diaries written in Soviet time, they virtually are worthless because they don't really reflect what was happening in life. And as
labai pasverto viso gyvenimo veikimo autorefleksija. Vytautas
Vaitiekūnas
užrašyti nepriklausomos Lietuvos kažkur maždaug atsiradimo laikais. Žmogus mirė po nepriklausomybės atkūrimo.
Died about 20 years after the restoration of independence. He was a partisan in the post-war years and legalized later. Really had a very hard life. So his diary is very well thought of, factual, and it also can suggest an idea that maybe there's later recollections is not really a bad thing. And also he was speaking about the habit to listen to the radio and the beginning and the end of war. We can also remember here, so how many Lithuanians met the beginning of war in their isolated houses, homes around the country, and then met the end of the war afterwards in cities, and the actions during the wars, the bombing, and the habit to listen to radio somewhere in the hiding. The author is very anti-communistic, but without any flavor of anti-Semitism. But the author was later on saying that he wanted to speak about security. But then he said he saw somebody beating Jews in the yard, so he decided to go home better. I also wanted to see some recollections and diaries of people who emigrated from Lithuania. And the more I met those people, and the more I became more convinced that it was rather difficult to use those, because it's hard to discern any authenticity. So what I did was, I referred to my favorite poet, Rubinstein, Rubinstein. I was even thinking about translating it.
2015 metais vyko Liuneburge procesas prieš Oskarą Gröningą.
And very interesting, because in 2015 there was a process against Oskar Gröning in Germany. And one of the prosecutors was Angela Olešrich, who was born in 1944, in December 1944. So she was not personally, she was not personally the victim of Auschwitz, but she was telling the story about what her parents experienced in Auschwitz, and the court admitted that as an evidence. So maybe historians can also refer to this kind of story. So her story was how they withdrew from Lithuanian towns with brother from Lithuania. So she was retreating with the Red Army as far from Lithuania as possible towards Moscow. So that was her experience. Rubinstein did not convey the story of his mother so clearly that it was the impression that time is not really obstacle to see what was happening. So he was speaking about the run from Vilkaviškis to Moscow, and that shows a different angle of the war experience. So history can be studied separately, but there can be a different approach. Of different recollections. So it is absolutely necessary to learn to isolate things, identify and then relate them back or merge them together. So how can we say in common about the witnesses and the recollections? So at the beginning of the war, it was possible to see, to understand what was happening, but later on the situation changed. There was some depending on the accumulated experience and expertise, the Polish and the Polish Jews arrived to Lithuania. On the other hand, the Soviet occupation changed the affairs and the expectations. everything depended on the personal experience, and it's important to ensure that in this atomized, electrified situation, the arriving war made the whole thing especially difficult and dangerous for our most vulnerable targets. Because, and in that respect, it's important to understand their characters. We will never go far enough in understanding of war if we don't isolate ourselves from our own understanding, which can be related to resistance movement and the massive Jewish. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much for your attention.
Čia Nerijus piknaudžiaudamas truputį mano kaip moderatoriaus.
Nerijus, by way of abusing his friendship with me as the moderator and as one of the author of the concept of this conference, indeed has given me not a presentation but the whole lecture, very much reflective. And in this way, also by responding to the insights given by previous speakers, so all I could do was to listen attentively and, by the way, having no other duty to generalize. And I was really listening very attentively and allowed him to speak as much as he could and as he would. Thank you very much for all the participants. Thank you very much for your patience, who have waited until the end of the conference. And we would like to thank the viewers as well as the interpreters, and in particular of that last presentation, I could imagine that that was quite a challenge, especially the end of this presentation was quite a challenge. And now I would like to invite everybody to come back at 11. At 11 to connect tomorrow and to participate in the conference. And by the way, we divided the conference into two parts, into the history and the memories. And today we also talked more about the memories of about memories. Tomorrow we're going to have two panels, which is going to be the third panel of this conference, dedicated to the evolution of memories and remembrance, and the remembrance of the end of the war up until the 1989 with the collapse of the Berlin Wall. And the fourth panel is going to be the roundtable discussion, which is going to discuss the conflicts of memories and the possible solutions or the prospects of solution. Already in the reality of the 21st century, and it is going to be hosted, this discussion, as a panel discussion. And after that, there will be the final concluding keynote address by the writer Thomas Venclova, who is going to give quite an interesting presentation. So thank you very much for all the participants of today, and I would like to officially close today's conference.